The cold morning air hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell stood at his post outside the state apartments. His red uniform pressed to perfection, his bearskin hat sitting tall and proud on his head, he remained completely still. For 3 years, James had served as one of the Queen's Guards, a position he held with immense pride and dedication. Every morning he would wake at dawn, polish his boots until they shined like mirrors, and take his position with the kind of discipline that had been passed down through generations of British soldiers. James came from a military family. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father had been in the Royal Navy, and his older brother was currently deployed overseas. When James joined the Queen's Guard, his family gathered to celebrate. His grandmother, tears streaming down her weathered face, had told him that he was carrying on a tradition that meant everything to their family. She gave him a small silver coin that his grandfather had carried through the war, and James kept it in his pocket during every shift. The tourists loved taking pictures with the guards. They would stand close, make funny faces, and sometimes try to make the guards laugh or move. James had learned to block it all out. He would focus on a spot in the distance and let his mind drift to pleasant thoughts while his body remained perfectly still. It was not easy, especially on days when his feet ached or when the weather was unbearable, but he never complained. This was his duty, and he performed it with honor. On this particular morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow across the ancient stone walls of the castle. A few early tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the famous guards. James could hear the distant sound of traffic from the streets of Windsor, the chirping of birds in the castle gardens, and the occasional bark of orders from the changing of the guard ceremony taking place nearby. Then something unusual happened. A convoy of black vehicles pulled up to the castle entrance. This was not entirely uncommon, as important visitors often came to Windsor. But something about this particular arrival felt different. The cars were sleek and modern, clearly expensive, and they bore diplomatic plates. Several men in dark suits emerged first, speaking into earpieces and scanning the surroundings with the trained eyes of security. Professionals. From the main vehicle stepped a tall man in a crisp military uniform. James recognized the insignia immediately. This was a high-ranking American military officer, likely a colonel or perhaps even higher. The man carried himself with confidence, his chest decorated with numerous medals and ribbons. Behind him came several other American military personnel and what appeared to be diplomatic staff. They were clearly here for some kind of official visit, though James had not been briefed about any such event. The American officer walked with purpose toward the state apartment's entrance where James stood guard. His entourage followed closely, their shoes clicking against the cobblestone courtyard. As they approached, James maintained his position, eyes forward, body perfectly still. He had been trained for situations like this. Less given specific orders by his superior officers, he was to remain at his post no matter who approached. The American officer stopped directly in front of James, so close that James could see the shine of the man's polished brass buttons. For a moment, nothing happened. The officer seemed to be studying James, perhaps expecting him to move or acknowledge the presence of such a high-ranking foreign military official. But James did not move, had his orders, and he would follow them. Then the officer spoke, his voice loud and clear, carrying across the courtyard where tourists had begun to gather, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. The officer's tone was not necessarily rude, but it was certainly commanding. The voice of someone accustomed to having orders followed immediately and without question. The American officer stated that he needed to enter the state apartments immediately for an urgent diplomatic matter. He explained that he was on official United States government business and that his credentials should grant him access. He then did something that made several of the watching tourists gasp. He looked directly at James and in a firm tone ordered him to step aside from his post. The courtyard fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. The tourists lowered their cameras, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The other American personnel shifted uncomfortably, uncertain about what was happening. Some of them had visited Britain before, and knew that the Queen's guards took their duties very seriously. But their commanding officer seemed determined to assert his authority. James felt the weight of every eye upon him. His heart was pounding. In his chest, though outwardly he remained completely calm. His mind raced through his training, through the rules and regulations he had memorized, through the oath he had taken when he joined the Guard. He thought about his grandfather's silver coin in his pocket, about his family's proud military tradition, about what this moment meant not just for him but for every guard who had ever stood at this post. The American officer repeated his command, this time more forcefully. He stated that as a foreign military officer on diplomatic business, he expected the courtesy of having the Guard move aside. He added that, in the United States, military personnel would show such courtesy to visiting foreign officials, implying that James should do the same. Still, James did not move. His jaw was set. His eyes remained fixed on the distant point he had chosen when he first took his post that morning. Sweat began to form on his brow, not from the physical strain, but from the intense pressure of the situation. He knew that whatever he did next would have consequences. If he moved, he would be abandoning his post without proper authorization, breaking the very rules he had sworn to uphold. If he remained, he risked creating an international incident with a high-ranking American military officer. The tourists continued to watch in fascination. Some had begun recording videos on their phones, capturing this unexpected confrontation. Among the crowd, an elderly British veteran stood with tears in his eyes, silently praying that the young guard would hold his ground. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking why the soldier would not move. The mother hushed him, understanding that they were witnessing something important. The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. James could feel the American officer's frustration growing with each passing second of silence. The other members of the diplomatic party were whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the situation that was unfolding. Some of them recognized that their commanding officer might be overstepping, but none dared to speak up and contradict him in public. Behind James, through the heavy wooden doors of the state apartments, he could hear the faint sounds of activity. Staff members were going about their morning duties, completely unaware of the standoff happening just outside. James wished desperately that one of his superior officers would appear and resolve this situation. But he knew that might not happen for several more minutes. The changing of the guard ceremony was still taking place on the other side of the castle, and most of the senior staff were occupied with that. The American officer took another step closer to James. He was now standing barely a foot away, well within what would normally be considered personal space. The officer's face was reddening slightly. Whether from anger or embarrassment, James could not tell. The man clearly had not expected this level of resistance from what he might have assumed was merely a ceremonial guard. More decoration than actual security. This was a common misconception that James and his fellow guards encountered regularly. Many people saw the traditional red uniforms and tall bearskin hats and assumed the guards were simply tourist attractions, actors playing a role. They did not understand that these were highly trained soldiers, many of whom had served in combat zones around the world. James himself had completed a tour in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. He had faced enemy fire, made life-or-death decisions in split seconds, and earned commendations for his bravery under pressure. The officer's voice rose again, this time with clear irritation. He stated that he did not have time for this nonsense and that he was ordering James, as a fellow military officer, to stand down and allow him entry. He mentioned something about international military courtesy and the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. His words were technically correct in some contexts, but they held no weight in this particular situation. James knew the rules perfectly. According to his orders, he was to guard this entrance and allow entry only to authorized personnel. Authorization came from his chain of command, not from foreign military officers, regardless of their rank. Even if a general from the British Army itself appeared, James would need to follow proper protocol. The only exceptions would be members of the royal family, or someone presenting proper credentials from his commanding officer. The crowd of tourists had grown larger. Word had spread quickly through the castle grounds that something unusual was happening, and people were hurrying over to watch. Camera phones were held high, recording every moment. James knew that whatever happened next would likely end up on social media within minutes, possibly going viral and being seen by millions of people around the world. The thought made his stomach tighten, but it also strengthened his resolve. He would not be the guard who abandoned his post because of pressure from a crowd. Among the growing audience, different reactions were visible. Some American tourists looked embarrassed by their countryman's behavior, recognizing that he was being unreasonable. British observers stood with arms crossed, defensive of their soldier and their traditions. A group of school children on a field trip watched with wide eyes, their teacher trying to explain what was happening while also learning from the situation herself. Then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd. He was wearing a blazer covered with military medals, a veteran from decades past. He addressed the American officer respectfully but pointedly, explaining that the guard was simply doing his duty and that no amount of pressure would or should make him abandon his post. The old veteran said he had fought alongside American soldiers in his youth and had great respect for the United States military. But that respect went both ways and included understanding and honoring the traditions and duties of Allied forces. The American officer turned to look at the elderly veteran, his expression flickering between annoyance and uncertainty. For a moment, it seemed like he might respond angrily, but something in the old man's dignified bearing and the weight of his medals made him pause. Other voices from the crowd began to murmur in agreement with the veteran. The mood was shifting, and not in the American officer's favor. Still, the officer was not ready to back down. He had created this confrontation in front of dozens of witnesses. His pride would not allow him to simply walk away without achieving his objective. He turned back to James and tried a different approach. His voice softened slightly, taking on a more reasonable tone. He explained that he understood the guard had his duties, but this was a matter of international importance. He asked if there was not some way to resolve this situation that would allow everyone to maintain their dignity. James felt a brief moment of sympathy for the officer. He understood that the man was in a difficult position, having created a standoff that he now needed to find a way out of without losing face. But sympathy did not change James's duty. He continued to stand perfectly still, eyes forward, giving no indication that he had even heard the officer's words. Inside James's mind, thoughts were racing. He wondered what his grandfather would have done in this situation. The old man had faced down German soldiers during the war, held positions under heavy fire, had made choices that meant life or death for himself and his comrades. This situation was different, certainly less immediately dangerous, but in its own way just as testing. It was a test of discipline, of commitment to duty, of understanding what it meant to be a soldier. The American officer tried once more, his voice returning to its commanding tone. He stated that he would be reporting this incident to the proper diplomatic channels, and that there would be consequences for this obstruction. He suggested that James was risking an international incident over nothing more than stubborn adherence to protocol. He painted a picture of the paperwork and investigations that would follow, the hassle and trouble that James would face, all of which could be avoided if he would simply step aside. For just a moment, James felt his resolve waver for just a fraction of a second. The officer was right that this could become complicated. There would indeed be reports to file, questions to answer, possibly even some uncomfortable meetings with superior officers. But then James remembered why he was here, what this uniform represented, what his position meant. He was not just standing guard over a doorway. He was representing something much larger, something that had existed for centuries and would continue long after he was gone. The standoff had now lasted several minutes, though it felt like hours to James. His legs were beginning to ache from standing so rigidly still, and the weight of his bearskin hat seemed to press down on him more heavily with each passing moment. But he had endured much worse during his training and during his time in active combat. This was uncomfortable, yes, but it was nothing compared to spending hours in a defensive position in the Afghan desert. Wondering if every shadow might be an enemy, the American officer was clearly running out of patience. His face had gone from red to a deeper shade of crimson, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that James could see the muscles working beneath the skin. The officer's colleagues were exchanging worried glances, and one of them, a younger lieutenant, stepped forward and whispered something in his superior's ear. Whatever he said made the officer's expression darken even further. Just then, a new element entered the situation. A British diplomatic official came hurrying across the courtyard, his suit jacket flapping behind him as he rushed toward the scene. He had obviously been summoned by someone, perhaps one of the castle staff who had noticed the commotion. Or maybe someone from the American diplomatic party had made a phone call. The official's face showed a mixture of concern and professional composure as he assessed the situation before him. The British official quickly introduced himself to the American officer. Extending his hand in greeting, he spoke in the calm, measured tones of someone trained in diffusing international incidents. He acknowledged the officer's important position and the significance of his visit, expressing regret that there seemed to be some confusion about the proper protocols for entry. The official explained that the State Departments had strict security procedures that applied to everyone, regardless of rank or nationality, and that these procedures existed for very good reasons. The American officer seized on this new arrival as an opportunity to state his case to someone with apparent authority. He explained his mission, the urgency of his diplomatic business, and his expectation that reasonable accommodations would be made for someone of his rank and purpose. He gestured toward James, stating that the guard's refusal to step aside was causing an unnecessary delay and creating an embarrassing situation for everyone involved. The British official listened patiently, nodding at appropriate moments and making sympathetic noises. When the American officer finished speaking, the official turned to look at James. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and James saw something in the official's expression that gave him strength. It was approval, pride even, though the official's face remained professionally neutral. The official then turned back to the American officer and said something that made the entire courtyard fall even more silent than before. He explained that the guard was performing his duty exactly as he should be. The official stated that these protocols were not arbitrary or flexible based on who was asking for entry. He mentioned that even high-ranking British officials, including ministers and military commanders, had to follow proper procedures when entering secured areas of the castle. The official added that this was part of what made British institutions respected around the world. This unwavering commitment to duty and protocol, regardless of external pressure. The American officer's expression went through several changes in rapid succession. First came disbelief, as if he could not quite accept what he was hearing. Then came a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. Finally, something like understanding began to dawn on his face. The official continued, explaining that proper arrangements could be made for the officer's entry through the correct channels, which would take only a few more minutes. He suggested that they step away from the guard post and discuss the matter in a more appropriate setting. For a long moment, the American officer stood frozen, clearly wrestling with his pride and his judgment. The courtyard remained utterly silent. Even the tourists seemed to be holding their collective breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. The other American military personnel and diplomatic staff watched their commanding officer carefully, uncertain about what would happen next. Then, slowly, the officer straightened his shoulders and took a step back from James. His face was still flushed, but there was something different in his expression now. He looked at James for a long moment, really looked at him, perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time. Here was not just a ceremonial decoration or an obstacle to be overcome, but a professional soldier performing his duty with the kind of discipline and commitment that any military officer should recognize and respect. What happened next surprised everyone in the courtyard. The American officer, instead of walking away in anger or embarrassment, did something completely unexpected. He came to attention, his posture becoming ramrod straight, his hands moving to his sides in perfect military form. Then, with slow deliberation, he raised his right hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute directed at James. The gesture hung in the air like something physical. It was an acknowledgement, an apology perhaps, and a sign of respect from one soldier to another. It recognized that while they wore different uniforms and served different nations, they shared a common understanding of what it meant to have a duty and to fulfill it.
Great.
regardless of the consequences or pressures. James, still maintaining his position as guard, could not return the salute. His duty required him to remain motionless at his post. But something in his eyes, a slight shift that only the most observant might notice, conveyed his own respect for the officer's gesture. It was a moment of understanding passing between two military men who, despite the confrontation that had just occurred, recognized something of themselves in each other. The American officer held his salute for several seconds, longer than strictly necessary, making sure that everyone watching understood the significance of what he was doing. Then he lowered his hand and turned to the British diplomatic official, stating quietly that he would be happy to follow proper procedures and wait for the appropriate authorization. His tone had completely changed. It was no longer commanding and demanding, but respectful and cooperative. The British official nodded appreciatively and gestured for the American party to follow him. As they began to walk away, the crowd of tourists erupted into spontaneous applause. The sound started small but quickly grew, echoing off the ancient castle walls. People were clapping not just for James, but for both men. For the way a potentially ugly international incident had been transformed into a moment of mutual respect and understanding. The elderly veteran who had spoken up earlier had tears streaming down his weathered face. He was clapping harder than anyone, his medals jingling with the movement. Several other veterans in the crowd were wiping their own eyes, moved by what they had witnessed. The young school children were clapping too, though they probably did not fully understand everything that had just happened. Their teacher was crying openly, one hand over her heart. As the American officer and his party walked away with the British diplomatic official, James remained at his post, still as a statue, but inside his emotions were churning. He felt relief that the confrontation had ended without escalating further. He felt pride that he had held his ground and performed his duty. He also felt a strange kind of respect for the American officer, who had ultimately chosen honor over pride by offering that salute. The crowd began to disperse slowly. Though many people lingered, taking photographs of James and talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed, several tourists approached to thank him, though of course he could not respond. An American couple stood before him with their young son, and the father quietly told the boy that what he had just seen was what real courage looked like. The courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. Behind James, inside the state apartments, the situation was being resolved through proper channels. The American officer was being processed through the correct security protocols, his credentials verified, and his purpose for visiting properly documented. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, proving that the delay he had been so concerned about was minimal when things were done correctly. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading rapidly through the castle. Other guards heard about what happened and felt a surge of pride in their colleague. James's commanding officer was informed and immediately began the process of documenting the incident. Knowing that it would need to be properly reported up the chain of command, the officer was prepared to defend James's actions completely. Having full confidence that the guard had performed his duty exactly as trained, the incident was also spreading beyond the castle walls. Several tourists had posted videos of the confrontation on social media, and they were being shared rapidly. Within an hour, the story was trending on multiple platforms. News organizations picked it up, running headlines about the standoff between the American officer and the British Guard. Commentary poured in from around the world, with most people expressing admiration for James's discipline and respect for the American officer's ultimate gesture of acknowledgement back at his post. James continued his duty as if nothing had happened. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. Tour groups came and went, some of them asking their guides about the soldier who had stood up to an American officer. The guides, most of whom had heard the story by now, related it with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment, turning it into part of the castle's living history. As noon approached, it was time for James to be relieved from his post. Another guard marched up in perfect formation, executed the change of guard ritual with precise military bearing, and took his position. James marched away, his back straight, his steps measured and exact. Only when he was safely away from public view, in the private areas where the guards could relax, Did he finally allow himself to take a deep breath and let his shoulders sag slightly with relief? His fellow guards routed around him immediately, congratulating him and asking for details about what had happened. James described the encounter modestly, downplaying his own role and acknowledging that he had simply done what any of them would have done. But his colleagues knew better. They understood that standing firm under that kind of pressure, with so many eyes watching and with the potential for serious consequences, required a special kind of strength. James's commanding officer called him to his office later that afternoon. James marched in, came to attention, and waited nervously, unsure whether he was about to be commended or reprimanded. The officer looked at him seriously for a long moment, then broke into a slight smile. He told James that he had handled the situation perfectly, and that his actions reflected great credit on himself, his unit, and the entire Queen's Guard. The officer also mentioned that there had already been communications with the American embassy, and that the American officer himself had sent a message expressing his respect for the guards. Professionalism. The commanding officer shared something else that James found particularly moving. He explained that the American officer had taken time to learn more about the Queen's Guard after the incident. The officer had discovered that many of these guards, including James, were combat veterans with distinguished service records. He had been embarrassed to realize that he had treated James as if he were merely a ceremonial figure rather than a fellow soldier, who had served with honor in some of the world's most dangerous places. That evening, James went home to his small apartment near the barracks. He was exhausted, both physically from the long day and emotionally from the intensity of the morning's confrontation. He made himself a simple dinner and sat down to call his family. His grandmother answered the phone, and before James could say anything, she told him that she had already heard about what happened. Someone had shown her the videos online. She had spent the afternoon crying with pride. She told James that his grandfather would have been so proud of him. She said that the old man had always believed that true courage was not about fighting or aggression, but about knowing what was right and standing firm for it no matter what pressures came against you. She said that James had honored not just their family's military tradition, but the deeper values that tradition represented. James's father called next, his voice gruffed with emotion. He did not say much, never had been one for long conversations. But he told James that he had done good and that the whole family was talking about him. His brother sent a message from overseas, saying that James's story had reached even their deployment location and that soldiers from multiple nations were discussing it, most of them expressing admiration for the way James had handled himself that night. James lay in bed thinking about the day's events. He thought about the American officer and wondered what the man was thinking now, whether he was angry or embarrassed or perhaps had gained a new perspective on things. James hoped it was the latter. He did not harbor any ill will toward the officer. He understood that the man had been operating under certain assumptions and had reacted badly when those assumptions were challenged. The important thing was that he had ultimately recognized his error, shown respect in the end. James also thought about what the incident meant for the future. He knew that the story would follow him for the rest of his time in the Guard, perhaps for the rest of his life. He would be known as the guard who stood up to the American officer. It was both an honor and a burden, reputation that he would need to live up to in everything he did going forward. But more than anything, James felt grateful. Grateful that he had been able to perform his duty as he had been trained to do. Grateful that the situation had resolved peacefully. Grateful for the support of his fellow guards, his commanding officers, and his family. And grateful for the opportunity to serve in a role that, while sometimes challenging and often uncomfortable, allowed him to be part of something larger than himself. The next morning, James woke to find that the story had grown even larger overnight. International news outlets were covering it, with journalists analyzing what the incident revealed about military culture, diplomatic relations, and the importance of tradition. Some commentators praised both men for ultimately showing mutual respect. Others criticized the American officer for his initial approach. A few questioned whether such strict protocols were necessary in the modern world, though they were quickly answered by veterans and military experts explaining exactly why such protocols existed. James tried to avoid reading too much of the coverage. He knew that fame, even the temporary kind that came from viral videos, could be dangerous. It could make a person think they were more important than they really were, could inflate the ego and distort perspective. He was just a soldier doing his job, nothing more. The fact that people found it interesting or inspiring was nice, but it did not change what he was or what he needed to do. When James arrived at the castle for his next shift, he was surprised to find a small crowd of people waiting specifically to see him. They had learned his schedule somehow, probably from social media discussions, and had come hoping to get photographs with the famous guard. Castle security had to manage the crowd, reminding people that the guards were there to work, not to pose for pictures, though they could certainly photograph them from a respectful distance. Among the crowd was a young man who looked to be in his early 20s. He waited patiently until James's shift ended and then approached him as he was leaving. The young man introduced himself as a university student who had been struggling with difficult decisions about his own future. He explained that watching James stand firm in his duty, refusing to be moved by pressure or intimidation, had inspired him to have more courage in his own life. The young man thanked James and walked away before James could really respond, leaving him standing there feeling both humbled and slightly overwhelmed. This became a pattern over the following days. People approached James to tell him how his actions had affected them. A woman told him that she had been in an abusive relationship and had finally found the courage to leave after seeing his example of standing firm against pressure. A businessman said that James's integrity had inspired him to refuse a lucrative but unethical deal. A teacher explained that she had shown the video to her students as an example of character and had seen it sparked meaningful discussions about duty, honor, and doing what was right, even when it was hard. James had never imagined that simply doing his job could have such ripple effects. He had thought of his duty as something personal, a commitment between himself and the institution he served. But he was beginning to understand that actions, especially in the modern age where everything could be recorded and shared, had consequences far beyond what anyone could predict. People were watching, learning, being influenced by what they saw. The incident also had unexpected consequences for international military relations. The American officer, whose name James learned was Colonel Robert Harrison, had written a formal letter to the British military command. In it, he apologized for his behavior and commended James for his professionalism. Colonel Harrison explained that the incident had been a learning experience for him, forcing him to confront some assumptions he had been carrying about ceremonial duties and the soldiers who performed them. The letter was shared with James by his commanding officer. Reading it, James felt a complex mix of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, but also a sense of connection to this man he had faced down. Colonel Harrison's words were honest and reflective, showing genuine growth from the experience. He wrote about his own military service, his pride in wearing his uniform, and how he had failed to recognize that same pride and commitment in James when they first encountered each other. Colonel Harrison's letter concluded with a request. He asked if it might be possible to meet with James properly, to shake his hand and speak with him as one soldier to another. The request went through proper channels, and eventually, James was asked if he would be willing to accept such a meeting. After thinking about it carefully, James agreed. He saw no reason to hold a grudge, and he was curious to speak with the man whose confrontation with him had sparked such widespread attention. The meeting was arranged for a quiet afternoon in one of the castle's private rooms. James arrived in his dress uniform, polished and pressed as always. Colonel Harrison was already there, also in dress uniform, his medals catching the light from the room's windows. When James entered, the colonel immediately stood and came to attention. Offering a proper military salute that James returned, they sat down across from each other. And for a moment, neither man knew quite what to say. Then Colonel Harrison broke the silence. He thanked James for agreeing to meet and apologized again for his behavior that day at the guard post. He explained that he had been under significant pressure with his diplomatic mission and had allowed that pressure to override his better judgment. He had treated James as an obstacle rather than as a fellow professional, and that had been wrong. James listened carefully and then responded. He explained that he held no ill will and that he understood the colonel had been in a difficult position. He talked about his own military service, his time in Afghanistan, what had led him to join the Queen's Guard. He shared his family's military tradition and what duty meant to him personally. As he spoke, Colonel Harrison listened with growing respect and understanding. The conversation continued for over an hour. They discovered they had more in common than either had expected. Both had served in combat zones. Both had lost friends to war. Both struggled with the transition from active combat duty to more ceremonial or administrative roles. They talked about the challenges of military life, the sacrifices required, and the pride that came from serving something larger than oneself. Colonel Harrison shared his own background. He had grown up in a small town in Texas, joined the military to pay for college, and had spent 20 years working his way up through the ranks. He had served in the Gulf War, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. He had earned his medals through genuine acts of courage and leadership. But somewhere along the way, he admitted, he had started to take his rank for granted, assuming that it alone commanded respect rather than his actions. James found himself genuinely liking the colonel. Despite their rocky first encounter, there was something fundamentally decent about the man. He had the courage to admit his mistakes, to learn from them, and to seek understanding rather than simply moving on and forgetting the incident. That took a different kind of bravery than facing enemy fire, perhaps a harder kind in some ways. Before they parted, Colonel Harrison asked if he could take a photograph with James, not for social media or public consumption, explained, but for his own office. He wanted to remember this meeting and what it had taught him. James agreed, and they stood together while an aide took the photograph. In it, both men stood at attention, pride evident in their bearing, representing their respective nations and the values they shared despite their different uniforms. In the weeks following his meeting with Colonel Harrison, James's life gradually returned to normal. The media attention faded, the crowds disappeared, and he resumed his regular duties at Windsor Castle. Yet something fundamental had changed within him. James had always taken his responsibilities seriously, but the incident crystallized why those duties mattered. It wasn't merely about following orders or maintaining tradition for its own sake. It was about representing something enduring in a changing world. Showing that principles and honor still meant something, that duty remained a living, breathing commitment rather than an outdated concept. His fellow guards noticed the subtle transformation. James had always been reliable, but now there was an extra depth to his presence. When younger guards joined the unit, he took time to mentor them, sharing not just technical aspects of their duties, but the philosophy behind them. He discussed what it meant to serve, the responsibility of wearing the uniform, and the public's trust in them. One nervous young guard, fresh from training, asked James how he maintained focus during difficult situations. James explained that focus came from knowing your purpose, from understanding you weren't just standing in one spot, but representing centuries of tradition and countless soldiers who had stood there before. When you felt part of something larger than yourself, temporary discomforts became easier to bear. The young guard absorbed every word. He later told James this conversation had completely changed his perspective, transforming guard duty from a boring assignment into an honor and responsibility. This quiet, personal impact meant more to James than all the media attention ever had. James maintained contact with Colonel Harrison through occasional emails, sharing thoughts on military matters and experiences. The colonel had returned to the United States, but continued reflecting on lessons from their encounter. He shared the story with his own troops as a teaching moment about respecting Allied forces, customs, and duties. He had also become more thoughtful about exercising authority, recognizing that rank was a responsibility rather than merely a privilege, the colonel shared. Something that deeply touched James, his own son. Considering military service, had been inspired by James's example. The boy watched the videos and read about the incident, helping him understand what military service truly meant. When Colonel Harrison's son eventually enlisted, he wrote James a letter thanking him for showing that being a soldier was about character and commitment, not just weapons and combat. James kept this letter in his locker alongside the silver coin from his grandfather. They reminded him why he served, of the connections military service created across generations and nations. On difficult days, when his feet ached and weather was miserable and tourists were particularly annoying, he thought about these connections and found renewed strength. The incident led to positive changes in how the castle handled visits from foreign dignitaries. Protocols were clarified and better communicated in advance, reducing chances of similar misunderstandings. The British diplomatic service created better briefing materials for international visitors, explaining the Queen's Guard's role and authority. These small administrative changes helped prevent future confrontations while maintaining essential security and traditions. James continued receiving messages from people inspired by his actions. A retired teacher used his story in lessons about citizenship and responsibility. A father thanked him for giving his daughter an example of courage through restraint and discipline rather than aggression. A veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress wrote that seeing James stand firm reminded him he too could face challenges with courage. These messages humbled James. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone, but had simply done his duty, following training and values instilled through years of military service. He was learning that sometimes the most powerful examples came from ordinary people doing their jobs with integrity, from those who stood firm when it would have been easier to give in. As months passed, James began considering his future. His time with the Queen's Guard would eventually end. Part of him wanted to return to active service, using his training more directly. But another part had discovered a passion for teaching and mentoring, for passing on values and lessons to the next generation of soldiers. His commanding officer encouraged him to consider training roles, pointing out that James had natural leadership qualities and that his unique experience could benefit young soldiers. The idea increasingly appealed to him. One afternoon, while standing guard, an elderly American couple approached. They recognized James from the famous video. The husband, clearly a veteran from how he carried himself, gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement before leaving. James couldn't respond while on duty, but he felt a connection to this fellow soldier who understood what it meant to serve with honor. That evening, walking home after his shift, James reflected on his journey. From a boy in a military family, through training and combat deployment, to guarding Windsor Castle, to that fateful confrontation that had changed so much. He thought about all the lives touched by that single moment, including his own. The incident had taught him something fundamental about human nature. People could change, recognize their mistakes, learn from them, and become better. Colonel Harrison had started as an antagonist, but had ended as something like a friend. That transformation was worth more than any medal or commendation. His phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Harrison.
Us!
Sending a photograph from a military academy where he was lecturing. Behind him on the screen was their photograph together in dress uniforms. The message read simply, teaching the next generation about duty, honor, and respect. Thank you for the lesson, my friend. James smiled. He made dinner and sat by his window looking at the evening sky. Tomorrow, he would wake early, polish his boots, press his uniform, and return to his post with the same dedication as always. But now he carried a deeper understanding of why it all mattered, of how one person standing firm for what was right could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. The silver coin from his grandfather was always in his pocket during shifts. James took it out and looked at it in the fading light. His grandfather had carried it through a world war, through battles and hardships James could barely imagine. Now James carried it through his own challenges, different but no less real. The coin was a physical link between past and present, between generations of soldiers sharing the same fundamental values. As darkness fell, James prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring another day of duty, another opportunity to serve with honor. And that, he had learned, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.